The bullet was already in the air when Commander Nathan Cross stopped breathing. 3,247 meters, the longest shot in recorded history, and the woman behind the trigger had been laughed at when her name appeared on the roster 48 hours ago. Cross had laughed. Out loud. He wasn't laughing now. On the balcony, Khaled Varez, the man who had ordered Gabriel Carter's death, crumpled without a sound. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The mountain just held the echo and gave it back, changed. If you're watching from your city, drop it in the comments. Subscribe. Now, this story is just beginning. The morning roster went up at 05:30, and Staff Sergeant Dominic Reyes read it twice because he was certain he'd misread it the first time. He hadn't. Right there at the bottom of the primary shooter designations, printed in the same flat government font as every other name on that board, was Carter E. Primary. Dominic folded the printout, walked it across the hangar to where Commander Nathan Cross was running through comms checks with his lead operator, and laid it on the table without a word. Cross picked it up, looked at it, set it back down. Who approved this? General Hale, directly. Cross said nothing for a moment. His jaw worked like he was chewing on something unpleasant. Then he picked up the printout again and looked at it like maybe the letters would rearrange themselves if he stared long enough. They didn't. Carter, he said. As in, Gabriel Carter's kid. Yes, sir. How old is she? 28. Cross set the paper down, pulled his cap off, ran a hand through his hair, and put the cap back on. Get me Hale on the radio, right now. That conversation lasted 11 minutes. Dominic stood outside the door and heard every word of Cross's end of it. The controlled objections, the professional concerns, the careful language a man uses when he disagrees with a general, but can't say you're out of your mind directly. He heard the long silences that meant Hale was talking, and he heard at the end Cross's voice drop low and flat. Yes, sir. Understood. He came out of the room, handed the radio back without looking at Dominic, and said, She arrives at 800. Make sure someone's there to meet her. Nobody was particularly enthusiastic about that assignment. Evelyn Carter arrived at 0802 in a truck she'd driven herself from the civilian lot, wearing mechanic coveralls that were 2 sizes too large and carrying a rifle case that had more road miles on it than most of the operators in that hangar had seen in their careers. The case itself was scratched along one side, the handle duct-taped at the grip, and her name wasn't on it anywhere. She signed in at the gate, accepted her visitor badge, and walked toward the main briefing building, the same way she'd walked through every place that had ever underestimated her steady, unhurried eyes forward. Specialist Annie Walsh was the one who met her. 24 years old, 3 years in, and the only person who'd actually volunteered for the task because she was curious. Ms. Carter. Just Evelyn. I'm Walsh. I'll take you in. Evelyn nodded, shifted the rifle case to her other hand, and followed her without another word. Walsh noticed 2 things. Immediately, the woman didn't look around the facility the way visitors usually did. No craning the neck, no impressed glances at the aircraft or equipment. And her hands were completely still. No nerves, no fidgeting, nothing. Just hands. Inside the briefing room, 4 of Cross's operators were already seated. When Evelyn walked in, the silence shifted, one of those silences that has a texture to it where you can feel the assessment happening in real time. The coveralls, the duct-taped case, the fact that she was a woman, the fact that she was 28 and looked like she might be 23. One of the operators, a big, broad-shouldered man named Kepler, who'd been running these kinds of missions for 9 years, leaned toward the man beside him and said something quiet. The other man smiled. Evelyn set her case on the table, unlatched it, and checked the rifle without looking up at either of them. You have a question, she said. Kepler looked up, surprised she'd heard him. I didn't say anything to you. No, Evelyn agreed. She seated the bolt, checked the action, set it back in the case. But you will eventually, so you may as well say it now. Kepler held her gaze. You ever taken a shot over 2,000 meters? Yes. In a live environment? Yes. What was the distance? She latched the case. 2,300. Slight downhill slope, 12-knot crosswind from the northwest, 71 degrees ambient. The target was moving. Kepler was quiet. "Did you hit it?" the man beside him asked. His name was Torres, and unlike Kepler, his tone wasn't mocking. It was genuinely curious. "I don't miss," Evelyn said. "Not with bravado, just as a fact, the same way you'd tell someone the temperature outside." All. General Victor Hale entered the briefing room at 08:45, and the shift in the air was immediate. The man carried authority the way certain people carry it, not loudly, not with theater, but with a kind of gravitational weight that made everyone in the room straighten slightly without quite meaning to. He was 61. Gray at the temples, lines deep around his eyes, from 20 years of staring at things most people never had to look at. He'd known Gabriel Carter for the better part of 2 decades, and when he looked at Evelyn, there was a moment, brief, almost invisible, where something crossed his face that wasn't professional at all. It passed. "Close the door," he said. Walsh closed it. Hale pulled up the tactical display without preamble and let the image speak for itself. Mountainous terrain, a compound circled in red coordinates marked in the upper corner. The number burned into the center of the display like a challenge. 3,247 meters. Khaled Varez, Hale said. "Most of you know the name. For those who don't, he directed 3 operations against American personnel in the last 4 years. He was responsible for the ambush that killed 8 soldiers in 2019. He has been underground since 2021. He paused. He resurfaced 48 hours ago at this location. He is expected to remain there for a window of approximately 72 hours before he moves again. We don't know where." "What happened to the primary team?" Torres asked. "Unavailable. That's not your concern." Cross, who had been standing in the back of the room with his arms crossed, said, "The shot distance is 3,247 meters. "I'm aware, Nathan. That's not a standard engagement. That's not even close to standard. The confirmed record is just over 3,000. "I know what the record is. Then you know what we're asking someone to do." Cross said it carefully, but his eyes moved just for a fraction of a second toward Evelyn. He didn't need to say her name. The implication was in the look. Evelyn said, "You're asking me to exceed the record by roughly 240 meters under real-world conditions." She said it without turning her head, still looking at the display. "I've run the preliminary calculations based on the terrain data in the pre-brief file. It's achievable. Difficult, not impossible." Silence. "You read the pre-brief file," Cross said. "Last night. I assumed it would be relevant." Another silence, this one with a different texture. Hale looked at Cross steadily. "The shot is achievable. The operator is qualified. This conversation is over." Time. It was after Hale left that Cross walked up to Evelyn directly for the first time. The room had thinned. Walsh had slipped out. Kepler and Torres were talking by the door, and Cross positioned himself across the table from her. Not aggressive, but not warm either. "I want to be straight with you," he said. "Please. I'm going to support this mission because I follow orders, but I want you to understand what's happening here. This isn't a range. There is no do-over. The team that goes with you, those are real people with real families. If the shot fails..." "The mission fails," Evelyn said. "I understand that. If the shot fails and we're already inside the extraction window, then we adapt execute contingency 2 and fight our way out." She held his eyes. "Commander, I have read the mission file. I have run the environmental models. I know who Varez is. I know what he did." She paused, and something moved in her face. Not grief exactly, but something adjacent to it, something older. "I know what he did." Cross studied her for a moment. She didn't look away. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. And for the first time, it wasn't tactical. It was an actual question, man to person. "You don't have to. You could have said no." Evelyn said, "My father never said no. Not once in 30 years. Cross had no answer to that. He picked up his cap, set it on, and walked to the door. He stopped there. "The operators will run integrated drills with you this afternoon," he said. "Everything is on the table for review. Ballistics, terrain, extraction routes. I'll be ready." He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and left. The drills that afternoon were where it began to turn. Not the skepticism that didn't evaporate in an afternoon, not for men who'd been operating at this level for years. But the calculus of it began to shift, and the shift was visible if you watched the right faces. Evelyn requested access to the full satellite imagery package for the target ridge and the surrounding terrain. She laid it across 2 tables, pushed together, weighted the corners with ammo cans, and spent 40 minutes studying it before she spoke a single word about extraction routes. When she did speak, she pointed to a fold in the terrain 300 meters south of the primary position that none of the others had flagged. If the wind shifts to a south-southeast pattern after the shot, which is statistically probable given the elevation and time of day, the acoustic signature will channel differently than the standard model predicts. Secondary observers at this position, she tapped the map, will have a 45-second detection advantage over what your current plan accounts for. That's not enough time to clear the primary route. Torres looked at the map, looked at Cross, looked back at the map. "She's right," he said. Kepler bent over the imagery, traced the terrain fold with his finger, and didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "You got an alternate?" "Yes." She pointed. "Here. Longer, harder, but it keeps the acoustic dead zone between us and the secondary observation post for an additional 4 minutes. That's your margin." Cross studied the route she'd indicated. He said nothing, but he made a mark on his copy of the imagery. That was the first shift. The second came during the ballistics review session, when Evelyn sat down with the team's own technical operator, a precise, careful man named Watts, who'd done the preliminary calculations and walked through her independent calculations alongside his. They matched in 12 of 15 variables. In the 3 where they diverged, Evelyn walked through her reasoning, and in 2 of those 3 cases, Watts concluded she was right. Watts, who had not smiled once in the preceding 6 hours, looked at her across the table and said quietly, "Your elevation adjustment for the last 800 meters of the trajectory. Where did you get the thermal gradient data?" "Personal weather station deployed to the ridgeline approximate 3 hours ago, remotely via a contact who was already in the area." She slid the data printout across. "I arranged it before I arrived this morning." Watts looked at the data, looked at her, back at the data. "You deployed a weather station to a live operational ridgeline before this briefing was even officially confirmed." "I like to be thorough." He almost smiled. "Yeah," he said. "I see that." That evening, after the drills, Evelyn sat alone in the equipment room with her rifle across her knees and worked through the assembly in the dark. Not because the light was bad, she'd turned it off herself. Her father had taught her that. If you can only work in perfect conditions, you're not ready. You're prepared. There's a difference. Gabriel Carter had said a lot of things like that. Things that had seemed at 8 years old, like the slightly confusing wisdom of a father who was always half somewhere else in his mind. Things that had seemed at 16 like the code of a man she deeply admired but could not quite reach. Things that had become in her 20s after the years of practice, and the miles, and the long conversations on the phone, in the months before he deployed for the last time, like the operating system of everything she knew how to do. She worked through the assembly, seated the bolt, checked the trigger housing, broke it down again, and did it from the beginning. Kepler appeared in the doorway at some point. She heard him before she saw him. The particular weight of his step was distinct. She'd catalogued it in the first hour. He stood there watching for a moment. "Lights off," he said. "I noticed." He was quiet for a moment. Then he came in, found a crate to sit on, and sat. Didn't speak, just sat. After a while he said, "I pulled your record this afternoon." "I assumed someone would." 2,300 meters, he said. "That was in Montana. Private range, no observers, no official verification." "That's correct. We can't verify it. No, she agreed. You can't. Kepler was quiet again. The assembly and disassembly continued in the dark, the sound of it soft and precise. Do you know what the difference between 2300 and 3247 actually feels like? He asked. Not on paper. Actually feels like when you're behind the glass. No, Evelyn said. I know what I've calculated. I know what I've trained for. I don't know what that exact distance feels like. Nobody does until they do it. It was the most honest thing she'd said all day. And Kepler, who had seen a lot of people in a lot of high-stakes situations, recognized honest when he heard it. He stood, moved toward the door. I'll run the south extraction route with you at 0600 tomorrow, he said. The terrain's rougher than it looks on imagery. Evelyn said nothing for a moment, continued the assembly. Then, I appreciate that. He left. She sat in the dark with her father's voice somewhere quiet in the back of her mind. And she finished the work. And when it was done, she sat with her hands still and her breathing even, and the rifle across her knees. You don't fire the gun, Gabriel Carter had told her once, when she was 12 and frustrated and missing the mark. The gun fires. You just have to get yourself completely out of the way first. That's the whole job. Everything else is preparation. She closed her eyes. Prepared. The 0600 run with Kepler nearly broke her left ankle. Not because the terrain was treacherous, though it was loose shale over compressed sandstone with a deceptive give to it that satellite imagery couldn't capture, but because she was moving too fast. Kepler had set the pace deliberately, and she'd matched it without complaint, and at the third switchback where the ridge dropped hard to the south, her boot caught an edge, and her weight went wrong for 1/2 second. That felt much longer. She caught herself. Dropped one knee absorbed, it pushed back up and kept moving. Kepler didn't stop, didn't look back. He said over his shoulder, That's the spot. Extraction under fire, full kit, probable low-light conditions. You just felt what I wanted you to feel. Evelyn steadied her breathing and caught up. I felt it. And we slow by 40 meters before that switchback and take the lower line. It costs us 12 seconds, but nobody goes down with a kit on their back. Kepler finally looked back at her. They were both breathing hard, altitude and pace combining into something honest and unfiltered. He nodded once. Okay, he said. That was all. They ran the rest of the route without speaking. By the time they came back in, Torres was already in the main planning room with Watts, and the table was covered in printouts. Evelyn dropped her pack, grabbed water, and crossed to the table, still breathing elevated. And nobody commented on it, because everybody in that room had run something hard that morning. The printouts were trajectory models. 17 of them, each representing a different combination of environmental variables at the projected engagement window. Temperature brackets, wind velocity ranges, humidity gradients. Watts had run them overnight, and he'd arranged them on the table in order of probability, most likely scenario at the top, lowest probability at the bottom. Evelyn picked up the top model, studied it for 30 seconds, set it down, and picked up the fourth one. Why 4? Torres asked. Because the most probable scenario assumes a stable thermal column between 800 and 1200 meters of the trajectory. And that column is only stable if the ambient temperature holds within a 2-degree band from the overnight reading. She set it down, picked up her water, drank. The overnight reading was accurate, but the forecast shows a 4-degree rise by 1100. That collapses the column. Changes the mid-trajectory drift by a fraction that matters at this distance. Torres looked at Watts. Watts said, She's correct. Torres picked up Model 4, looked at it, set it back down. So what's our best window? Evelyn said. Between 0940 and 1020. Narrow. Varèse's pattern puts him on the balcony for his morning communications between 0930 and 1000, based on the surveillance footage. If the thermal holds and the wind stays below 8 knots from the northwest, we have a viable window of approximately 14 minutes. And if the wind goes above 8, then we wait. There may not be a second window that day. The room was quiet for a moment. Cross walked in carrying a coffee he'd been nursing since before sunrise. He stopped at the edge of the table, looked at the printouts, looked at Evelyn. "What are we looking at?" 14-minute window, Torres said. "Day after tomorrow, assuming weather holds." Cross looked at Evelyn. "You comfortable with that window?" "I'm comfortable with the shot I need to take within that window. Yes, that's not exactly what I asked." Evelyn set her water down. "Commander, no one is comfortable with this. Comfortable is the wrong word for any of it. I am prepared. That's the word I'd use." Cross held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked at the printouts on the table, picked one up, studied it. "Watts," he said. "Sir?" "Walk me through the 4-scenario contingency if the window closes after the shot and before extraction." And they were back to work. The full integration drill happened that afternoon, all 7 of them, Evelyn included, running the full operational sequence at a simulated ridge position 40 minutes from base. Kepler ran security on the left, Torres on the right. Watts was positioned as the technical observer. Walsh, who had transitioned from meet and greet to full tactical role without anyone formally announcing it, handled communications. 2 additional operators named Garza and Fitch covered the extraction corridor, and Evelyn took the shooter's position. She'd brought her own mat. That detail registered with several people, and none of them said anything about it. It was worn smooth along the left elbow contact point. The color faded from what had probably once been military tan to something closer to the color of old paper. It had been used a great deal and carefully. She positioned behind the rifle, settled her breathing, and for the next 4 hours operated with a focus that was almost uncomfortable to watch up close. Kepler watched it from the security position when his sweep patterns brought him near enough. He'd seen shooters in his career, good ones, excellent ones, the occasional genuinely gifted one. The gifted ones had a quality he'd never been able to articulate cleanly. It wasn't stillness exactly, because their bodies made small, constant adjustments. It wasn't concentration, because concentration implied effort, and this looked like the opposite of effort. It looked like someone who had stopped fighting the environment and simply become part of it. Evelyn Carter had that quality. He didn't tell her that. But by the time the drill ended and they were packing equipment in the cooling afternoon air, Kepler had quietly reassessed most of what he'd walked into that briefing room thinking. The person he'd dismissed as an unverified name on a roster was something else entirely, and the part that really got him somewhere below the professional calculation was that she'd clearly known it all along and hadn't bothered to prove it to anyone. She'd simply worked. The debrief that evening ran 3 hours. Cross ran it hard the way he ran everything. No softness, no courtesy gaps. Every assumption challenged and every number interrogated. He pushed Watts on the trajectory models until Watts pushed back, and he pushed Garza on the extraction timing until Garza produced 3 alternative routes from memory, and Cross approved 2 of them. He went around the table systematically, and when he got to Evelyn, he sat back slightly and said, "Your call on the shot conditions. Walk me through the decision tree, the actual one, not the textbook version." Evelyn said, "I acquire. I run the environmental check wind read from the Kestrel cross-reference with the weather station data and the visual indicators at the target side terrain. If they're within parameters, I communicate to Watts. He confirms I engage. If they're not within parameters, I hold, and we reassess." "How long do you hold before you call it?" "As long as necessary. There's a team on that ridge with you." "I know that." "The longer you hold, the longer they're exposed." "I know that too." Her voice didn't rise. "Commander, every additional minute on that ridge is risk I'm aware of and will not take casually. But a rushed shot at 3,200 meters with degraded conditions doesn't miss clean. It misses in ways that compromise the mission and potentially alert the target. I will not rush it." Cross studied her. "What if the window closes entirely? Varese goes inside, doesn't come back out. What then?" "Then we extract cleanly, and we reassess with updated intelligence." "And Varese walks." "That day, yes." She held his eyes. "I understand what that means. I understand who he is and what he's done. I will not let that push me into a shot I'm not certain of. Certainty is the only thing I have to offer here. Without it, I have nothing." The room was very quiet. Torres, across the table, was looking at his hands. Cross said nothing for a moment. Then, "All right." He moved on to the next item. But Garza, who was sitting to Evelyn's left and had been watching Cross's face during that exchange, noticed that something had shifted in it. Not warmly, Cross wasn't a warm man, and the mission wasn't a warm context. But something had settled. Like a variable that had been floating, had finally resolved into a fixed point. He filed it away and said nothing. The hardest conversation of the preparation period happened late after everyone else had gone. It wasn't planned. Evelyn was at the equipment table doing the nightly rifle check. It had become a fixed ritual. The dark room, the disassembly and reassembly when General Hale appeared in the doorway. He was still in uniform, which meant he hadn't slept, which was consistent with everything she'd known about him across the years. He'd been at her father's funeral, had stood at the back in civilian clothes and hadn't spoken to her mother. She'd seen him from across the room and recognized him from photographs, and she'd thought at the time that a man who showed up to a funeral in civilian clothes so as not to make it about the uniform was a man who actually understood what grief was. "How are you holding up?" Hale asked. He didn't sit, stood in the doorway with his arms at his sides. "Fine. That's the answer you give people you don't trust. I'm not asking as your commanding authority right now." Evelyn paused the assembly, set the bolt down. "I'm nervous," she said. "Not about the shot, about the part after, about what it means when it's done." Hale was quiet. "My father did this for 30 years, she said. He was calm about it. Genuinely calm, I think, not performed calm. I don't know how he got there." "He wasn't always," Hale said. "The first years were hard for him. He didn't talk about it much, but I knew him well enough." Evelyn looked at the rifle parts on the table. "He talked about you," Hale said. "In the last year more than before. Said you'd surpassed him technically. He was proud of that, and also a little unsettled by it, I think. Your father was a man who liked being the best in the room." Something moved across Evelyn's face. She kept looking at the table. "He didn't want this for you," Hale said. "I need to be honest about that. He wanted you to have the skill and never need to use it this way. But he also understood that sometimes the person who can do the thing is the person who has to do it. That's not a comfortable truth. He lived with it." Evelyn was quiet for a long time. The equipment room held its silence around her. Then she said, "Was it him, Vares? Was it a direct order he gave, or was he further up the chain?" Hale looked at her steadily. "Why?" "Because I want to know what I'm carrying into that position. I want to know the weight of it exactly." Hale said, "He gave the order, directly. We have documentation." Evelyn picked up the bolt, seated it, checked the action. "Then I have everything I need." Hale looked at her for a moment longer. Then he said quietly, "Your father would be proud, not of the shot, of who you've become." He left without waiting for her response, which was good because she didn't have one that she could have said out loud in that moment. She sat with it for a while, alone in the dark with the rifle across her knees, and when she was ready, she finished the assembly and set it aside, and let herself just briefly feel the full weight of what she was carrying. Her father's voice somewhere quiet. The gunfires. "You just have to get yourself completely out of the way first." She breathed. She would be ready. The morning of the operation, the team assembled at 04:15. Nobody was loud. Nobody was performing calm either. There's a difference between a team that's quiet because they're nervous, and a team that's quiet because they've done the work, and they know it, and this was the second kind of quiet. Equipment checked, loaded, distributed without ceremony. Comms verified. The weather station on the ridgeline reported wind at 6.4 knots from the northwest. Temperature holding within the projected band. Evelyn was the last one to the vehicles. She'd spent 20 minutes alone before coming out, and nobody asked what she'd been doing because every person on that team had their own version of 20 minutes alone before the hard thing. She climbed in, settled her rifle case across her knees, and looked straight ahead. Walsh, seated across from her, said quietly, "How are the numbers?" "Good." "Wind?" 6.4. "It'll settle as the sun comes up and warms the western face. Maybe 5.8 by 0930. Walsh nodded, said nothing else. But she kept her eyes on Evelyn for a moment, and what she saw there wasn't fear, and it wasn't bravado, and she filed that away as the most reassuring thing she'd seen since this operation began. Cross in the front didn't turn around, but he said to no one in particular into the darkness of the vehicle, "Everyone goes home today. That's the mission. The shot is the mission. Everyone going home is the other mission. Both matter equally. Are we clear?" A murmur of assent moved through the team. Evelyn said nothing. She was already calculating. The vehicles moved out into the pre-dawn dark, and the mountain waited, and somewhere 3,247 meters away, a man who had given an order 4 years ago slept without knowing that the consequence of that order was moving toward him at 30 miles an hour through the Arizona dark. And in the back of the vehicle, Evelyn Carter sat with her hands completely still, her breathing measured, and even her mind moving through every variable. One last time, the way her father had taught her not to find new problems, but to confirm that every problem had an answer, that the preparation was complete, that when the moment came, there would be nothing left to do except get out of the way and let the work happen. She got to the end of the list. Everything had an answer. She closed her eyes for the last 11 minutes of the drive and let herself be still. They reached the staging position at 0611. The last 400 meters had been on foot, full kit, no lights. Kepler led the line. Evelyn second, the rest of the team spread at intervals behind her. Nobody spoke. The comms stayed silent by protocol: 1 click for hold, 2 for advance, 3 for abort. And the only sounds were boots on rock and the faint, steady movement of wind across the ridge above them. Evelyn had her rifle slung across her back and her pack forward-weighted for balance on the ascent, and she climbed with the same unhurried steadiness she'd brought to everything else. Her breathing was controlled. Her mind was running the variable checklist on a quiet loop: wine temperature, humidity, target side thermal gradient, not anxiously the way a person runs a list when they're afraid they've forgotten something, but the way a pilot runs pre-flight checks. Systematic, confirming what is already known. They reached the shooter's position at 0638. It was a natural depression in the rock, partially sheltered from the western wind, with a clean line of sight across the valley to the target compound. Watts had flagged it on imagery 6 days ago. In reality, it was slightly narrower than the model suggested, which meant Evelyn's left elbow would be closer to the rock face than ideal, which meant a micro-adjustment in her support position, which she made automatically and without comment as she settled in. Kepler positioned security without being told. Torres took the eastern approach. Walsh set up communications 30 meters back-angled for line of sight to the satellite relay. Garza and Fitch covered the extraction corridor. It happened in 4 minutes clean and practiced the way it had happened in the drills, except that this time the valley below them was real, and the compound in the distance was real, and the man inside it was real. Watts settled beside Evelyn with his spotting scope and his own data pad, and they did not speak for a moment. Both of them looking at the target position through their respective optics, both of them reading the same information in their different ways. Then Watts said quietly, "Wind at target side is showing 5.6 from the northwest, consistent with the morning forecast." "I've got 5.9 here," Evelyn said. "Kestrel reading from 30 seconds ago. Split the difference at 5.75. I'll use 5.8 and adjust if I see movement in the indicator grass at the 900-meter mark." Watts looked through his scope at the indicator grass. She'd designated a patch of sparse vegetation on a lower ridge that would serve as a visible wind gauge at approximately the midpoint of the trajectory. He'd noticed her mark it on the imagery during planning. He hadn't asked about it then. He was glad she'd done it now. "Confirmed," he said. "I've got the grass." Cross's voice came through the earpiece, low and controlled. He was positioned with Walsh at the communications point running coordination. Team confirm positions. One by one they clicked in. When it came to Evelyn, she said, "Shooter set, waiting on target." Copy. Target last confirmed inside at 0540. Pattern puts him on the balcony between 0930 and 1000. We have time. Nobody moves before I say move. Evelyn adjusted her scope. The compound at 3,247 meters looked through the glass like something that existed in a different atmosphere. The resolution was extraordinary. She could see the balcony railing, the door behind it, the outdoor table where surveillance imagery had shown Varez conducting his morning communications. She could see the chair. Empty. She settled in to wait. The waiting was its own discipline, and it was the part most people didn't understand about this work. They imagined the shot. They didn't imagine the hour before the shot when the body had to stay perfectly calibrated, not tense, not loose, not cold, not overheated, while the mind stayed present without going anywhere it shouldn't. Evelyn had learned to wait from her father, who had learned it from a man named Sergeant Proctor, who had served in Vietnam, and who had described patience not as the absence of action, but as action sustained inwardly, while the exterior held still. Gabriel Carter had passed this on to his daughter in the way fathers pass on the most important things, not in a single deliberate lesson, but in accumulated small moments. A word here, a correction there, until the principle lived in the body and not just the mind. She thought about him now. Not painfully, just present. The way you carry someone you've lost, they don't disappear. They become part of the architecture of who you are. At 0741, Kepler's voice came through the earpiece. 2 clicks hold. Then his voice. Movement on the northern approach. Foot traffic civilian profile. 2 individuals moving parallel to the ridge, not toward us. Evelyn stayed still, controlled her breathing. The 2 individuals confirmed by Torres from the eastern position as a pair of locals moving along a trail that predated the compound by decades passed below the ridgeline and continued south. Garza tracked them for 8 minutes until they were definitively clear of the operational area. Cross's voice. Clear. Maintain positions. Evelyn released a breath she hadn't entirely been aware she was holding. You good? Watts murmured. Yes. Heart rate. She almost smiled. You can't actually read my heart rate, Watts. No, he said. But I can read your breathing and it's good. Just checking. She didn't respond. But something about the exchange steadied her in a way she hadn't expected. Not because she needed steadying, but because the care in it was real and real things anchored you to the present in a way that nothing else did. At 0847, the weather station data shifted. Watts caught it first. His datapad updated with a push notification from the remote station on the ridgeline. Temperature had risen 0.4 of a degree faster than the forecast model predicted. Small. Possibly irrelevant. Possibly not. We've got a faster thermal rise, he said quietly. 0.4 above the 0800 projection. Evelyn processed that immediately. A faster thermal rise meant the atmospheric column she'd been counting on for trajectory stability would destabilize earlier than planned. Not catastrophically, but the window she'd projected between 0940 and 1020 might compress starting later as the instability built or closing earlier than expected. How fast is the progression? She asked. Difficult to say with one data point. Pull the last 4 readings, give me the rate. Watts worked his pad for 90 seconds. Rate suggests the column begins degrading at approximately 1005 rather than 1020. So our window is 0940 to 1005, approximately. 25 minutes instead of 40. Cross, Evelyn said. Heard it. We work with it. Varez's pattern is consistent. He's been on that balcony by 0945 every observed morning. We have a window. Evelyn said, if he's late today, then we hold, and we make the call in real time. You've run degraded conditions models, Carter. We use what we have. She'd run those models. She knew what degraded conditions looked like at this distance. It wasn't impossible. It was harder and harder at 3,247 meters was a meaningful distinction. She said nothing more. Settled back into the rifle, steadied her breathing, and watched the empty chair through the glass. No. At 0921, the door opened. Evelyn's heartbeat, which had been running slow and steady at approximately 52 beats per minute for the last 40 minutes, did not change. This was the discipline. This was the thing she'd worked for years to build, the capacity to remain physiologically calibrated in the moment of maximum consequence. She watched. A figure stepped onto the balcony. Male, middle-aged, heavy across the shoulders, moving with the unhurried confidence of a man in his own space. He carried a phone and a ceramic cup, and he set the cup on the table and looked out across the valley, the way people look out across things they consider theirs. Watts, Evelyn said. Just the name. Watts had his scope on the balcony already. Confirming. Physical profile matches. Clothing consistent with surveillance imagery. Give me 30 seconds. 30 seconds was a very long time when every variable in the environment was in motion. Watts said, "Confirmed. That's Varese." Evelyn said, "Cross." "Confirmed on comms relay." Cross said immediately. Walsh had the long-distance visual on a separate system and had already cross-referenced. "Target identified. Authorization is live. Carter, it is your call." Her call, 3,247 meters. 5.8 knots northwest. Temperature holding. The indicator grass at the 900-meter mark bending in a consistent readable pattern. The thermal column, she could feel it in the behavior of the air, in the microscopic data, the scope and the kestrel, and the weather station, and 4 years of her father's teaching gave her simultaneously still stable. For now. She began her breathing sequence. In through the nose, 4 counts. Hold, 2 counts. Out through the mouth, 6 counts. The sequence slowed everything that needed to be slow, and kept clear. Everything that needed to be clear. Her trigger finger rested against the guard, not the trigger. Not yet. You didn't touch the trigger until you were ready to fire, and you didn't fire until the body and the mind and the environment all arrived at the same point simultaneously. Her father's voice. "Get out of the way." She was getting out of the way. Watts said quietly, "Wind is reading consistent. 5.7 at the indicator. Good." Evelyn was already beyond verbal processing. She heard him the way you hear ambient sound registering without distracting. Her scope held the balcony. Varese was on his phone now, pacing 2 steps left, 2 steps right, the way people pace when a call matters. He'd stopped by the railing. He was still. Her finger moved to the trigger. Her breath went out slow, controlled, to the natural respiratory pause between exhale and the next inhale, the stillest point in the body's cycle, the point her father had called the quiet, the place where everything unnecessary falls away and only the essential remains. She found the quiet. She pressed the trigger. The Barrett fired. The sound of it hit the rock face and rolled across the valley, and came back changed, flattened by distance, into something that didn't sound like a shot at all. And for 1.7 seconds, the calculated flight time of the round across 3,247 meters of mountain air, nobody breathed. Watts had his scope locked on the balcony. His voice, when it came, was very controlled. The kind of controlled that lives right next to something much less controlled. "Hit," he said. "Target is down." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds. 3 seconds of pure, stunned quiet from a team of people who had collectively seen a great deal and who were in this moment seeing something they had not fully believed they would see. Then Torres said from the eastern position, "Did she," and didn't finish the sentence. Kepler's voice came through flat and precise. "Confirmed visual on the balcony. Target down. No movement." Cross said, "Carter. Confirmed hit. Outstanding." Evelyn released the breath she'd been holding since the trigger broke. Her cheek came off the stock. Her eyes, when she blinked, were dry. Her hands were still. She'd expected to feel something enormous. Relief, grief, vindication, some flood of emotion proportional to everything that had led to this moment. What she felt instead was quieter than that. Something that settled rather than rushed. Like a weight that had been carried so long you'd stopped noticing it, and now it was simply gone. She said extraction, we move now. That snapped the team back. Cross's voice already back to operational tempo. Extraction is live. Carter pack and move. Kepler lead. Everyone on the south route lower line at the third switchback. Go. Evelyn broke down the rifle in 14 seconds, 3 seconds slower than her best time, which she noticed and filed without judgment. Because 14 seconds was still fast enough, and had it in the case and the case across her back before Kepler reached her position. He looked at her for exactly 1 second as she stood up. He said nothing, but the look said something she'd remember for a long time. They moved. The extraction started clean and went hard at the 11-minute mark. The acoustic signature had channeled exactly as Evelyn had predicted the shot sound funneling south through the terrain in a way that gave the secondary observation post an earlier detection window than the standard model would have suggested. Varèse's security had radioed within 4 minutes of the shot, and by the time the team was moving through the third switchback, there were armed personnel on 2 of the 3 viable approach lines to their route, not the south route. The south route with the lower line at the switchback remained clear. Kepler moved through it at a pace that would have broken a civilian in the first 3 minutes. Nobody broke. Garza was breathing hard by the 7th minute, the altitude and the weight and the pace working against each other, but he kept his position and didn't ask for adjustment, and nobody offered it because everyone understood that asking was not available right now. Evelyn ran with the rifle case across her back and her sidearm drawn, and her mind doing 2 things simultaneously, tracking the terrain ahead and monitoring the comms for anything that changed the tactical picture. The tactical picture changed at minute 14. Walsh's voice, "I've got a vehicle on the eastern track, moving parallel to us 200 meters out. They may not know exactly where we are, but they're moving in the right direction. Cross, speed. Walsh, matching ours, maybe slightly faster. Cross, Fitch. Fitch, rear security. I've got them on visual. 1 vehicle, 4 personnel armed. They're running without lights. 4 against 7 in terrain that favored nobody with a vehicle advantage that would evaporate when the track ended against the ridge wall in approximately 600 meters. Cross had studied this terrain. He knew where the track ended. We have 6 minutes before that track terminates, he said. After that, they're on foot, and we have the position advantage. Nobody engages before that vehicle stops unless we take fire. Understood. Acknowledged around the line. 6 minutes was a long time to run. They ran. At minute 18, the vehicle stopped track termination exactly as Cross had predicted. Doors opened. Evelyn heard it in the comms relay from Fitch, 4 armed personnel deploying on foot into terrain they didn't know as well as the team did, moving toward a position that was already moving away from them. The team crested the final ridge at minute 22, and the helicopter was there, rotors already turning. Watts having sent the extraction signal 8 minutes prior. They loaded in 40 seconds. Kepler, last pulling himself in as the aircraft began to lift, and the door closed, and the ground fell away beneath them. Nobody spoke for a full minute. Then Torres said to no one in particular, 5.8 knots. Nobody answered him. But several people understood exactly what he meant. Cross was sitting across from Evelyn. He looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that isn't calculating anything, isn't assessing or measuring, just looking. Then he said quietly enough that it was between them and the engine noise. I owe you an apology. Evelyn met his eyes. She was breathing hard from the run. Her hair was matted against her forehead, and there was a cut on her right palm from the rock face at the second switchback that she hadn't noticed until just now. She said, "No, you don't. You had to be certain. That's the job." I laughed, Cross said. "When I saw your name, I actually laughed." She held his gaze. "I know. Walsh told me." Cross absorbed that. "And you still—" "The mission didn't change because of your opinion of me," Evelyn said. "It never does." Cross was quiet. Then he nodded a real nod, not the brief professional acknowledgement she'd gotten from him twice before, but something that carried actual weight. "Your father," he said. "He was one of the best I ever saw operate." Evelyn looked at her hands. The cut was deeper than she'd thought. She folded her fingers over it, applied pressure. "I know," she said. She looked out at the mountain range receding below them, and the morning sun catching the western faces of the peaks and turning them gold, and she let herself sit inside the magnitude of what had just happened without rushing to make it mean something, without packaging it into words or conclusions. Her father had always said that the moments worth having were the ones you had to sit inside for a while before you understood them. She sat inside this one. The helicopter carried them south, and the mountain fell away behind them, and Evelyn Carter held her cut hand and breathed the recycled air of the aircraft cabin, and felt for the first time in 4 years that the weight she'd been carrying had somewhere to go. The FOB medic's name was Sergeant Dana Okafor, and she was not impressed by people who ignored injuries. She'd been waiting at the landing pad with her kit when the helicopter came in standard post-extraction protocol, and she'd done her sweep of the team in under 3 minutes, checking eyes, checking hands, checking the particular quality of stillness that sometimes meant shock rather than calm. She'd cleared 5 of them quickly. She stopped at Evelyn. "Let me see the hand." Evelyn held it out without argument. The cut across the palm had clotted during the flight, but not cleanly. The rock had taken a jagged line rather than a straight one, and Okafor's expression when she opened it said more than she did for a moment. "How long ago?" "Extraction, 3rd switchback, maybe 20 minutes in." "You ran the rest of the route with this open?" "I applied pressure." "With what?" "My other hand." Okafor looked up at her. "That's not ideal." "No." Evelyn agreed. It wasn't an ideal situation. Okafor closed it with 6 sutures that she placed with the same precise economy Evelyn used on a trigger and taped it without ceremony. "You'll want to keep that dry for 72 hours, which I'm sure you'll do religiously." "Of course." Okafor gave her a look that said she didn't believe that for a second, handed her a sealed packet of wound care instructions and moved on. Cross was watching from 10 feet away. He didn't say anything, but when Evelyn stood and flexed her taped hand experimentally, and her face registered nothing, he filed it under a category he was still building in his mind. A category that had started empty 2 days ago and was now crowded with data points he hadn't anticipated collecting. The formal debrief started at 13:40 in the main operations room at the FOB. General Hale ran it personally, which was unusual enough that Torres and Garza exchanged a glance when he walked in. Hale didn't run debriefs as a rule. He received the reports, he asked questions of the debrief officers, he made decisions. He didn't sit at the table with a recorder running and work through the operational sequence himself. He sat at the table now. The debrief was thorough and took 2 hours and 14 minutes. Every decision point was examined: the window, compression, the vehicle pursuit, the alternate extraction line, the 14-second breakdown of the rifle. Hale asked questions that were precise and unhurried, and he listened to the answers without interrupting, which was its own kind of pressure, because it meant every answer had to stand on its own. When they reached the shot itself, Hale looked at Watts first. Conditions at time of engagement. Watts read from his data log: wind 5.7 knots northwest, consistent with morning forecast adjusted for thermal acceleration. Temperature 68.4 degrees Fahrenheit at shooter position, estimated 66.1 at target. Humidity 31%. Atmospheric pressure. Give me the bottom line. Watts looked up. Conditions were within parameters. Not ideal. Within parameters. Hale looked at Evelyn. Your assessment at the moment of engagement. Consistent with Watts, Evelyn said. The thermal column was beginning to show early degradation signs. I could read it in the indicator grass behavior and in the Kestrel data. I had approximately 4 minutes of viable window remaining when I engaged. Possibly less. Possibly less, Hale repeated. Yes, sir. What would you have done with 2 minutes? Taken the shot. 1 minute. Evelyn was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. I would have assessed whether 1 minute was enough. If it was, yes. If it wasn't, I would have held and called the window closed. And if Perez had gone inside before a second window opened, then the mission would have required new intelligence and a new plan. Hale nodded slowly. He wrote something on his pad. Nobody could see what it was. Then he looked up and said, "The confirmed distance independently verified by two separate measurement systems is 3,247 meters. The previous verified record engagement distance was 3,009 meters, set in 2009. He paused. "This engagement exceeds that record by 238 meters. Nobody moved. Hale said, "The verification documentation is already being prepared. It will be classified at the appropriate level, consistent with the operational context." He looked at Evelyn directly. "You are aware of what this means formally?" "Yes, sir." "And unofficially?" Evelyn said, "It means the shot worked. That's the part that matters." Hale looked at her for a long moment. Then something moved across his face that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to it, and he wrote something else on his pad and said, "Dismissed, all of you. Get food, get rest. I want individual written reports on my desk by 0800 tomorrow." The team stood, gathered materials, moved toward the door. Hale said, "Carter, stay." The room cleared. Walsh glanced back at Evelyn from the doorway with an expression that was half concern and half something warmer. Then the door closed, and it was just the two of them and the recorder, which Hale reached over and switched off. He didn't speak immediately. He set his pen down on the pad and sat back in his chair and looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the equipment room 2 nights ago, not as a general, not as an authority, but as a man who had known her father and who was sitting across from the consequence of that friendship in a way that moved him. "How are you?" he asked. "I don't know yet," Evelyn said, and it was the truest thing she'd said all day. Hale nodded. "That's honest." "I keep waiting for it to hit," she said. "Whatever it's supposed to feel like? I don't know what it's supposed to feel like." "There's no supposed to," Hale said. "I've seen men collapse after a lot less, and men walk away from a lot more without flinching and spend years figuring out what they missed. There's no correct response." Evelyn looked at her taped hand. "My father. Did he after his first one? Did he talk to you about it?" Hale was quiet for a moment. "He called me," he said finally. "From a payphone of all things. This was 1998. People still used payphones. He didn't say much. He just needed someone to be on the other end of the line." Evelyn thought about her father at 26, standing in a phone booth somewhere in the dark. She'd never imagined him that young, that uncertain. In her memory, he had always been fully formed, steady, capable, the person other people leaned on. "Was he okay?" she asked. "Eventually," Hale said. "Yes, he was okay." She nodded. "Filed that somewhere important." "You should call your mother," Hale said. "Tonight if you can. She doesn't know the details of what you were doing here, but she knows you were doing something because she's known you your whole life, and she knows when you're carrying something." Evelyn said, "I know." "She lost her husband to this work," Hale said. "She doesn't need to lose you to the silence of it too." That landed somewhere it was meant to land, and Evelyn didn't try to deflect it. She just sat with it for a moment and then said, "I'll call her tonight." Hale stood. The meeting, whatever it had been, was over. He picked up his pad, clicked his pen, walked toward the door. He stopped. "Your father told me once," he said, not turning around, "that the hardest shot he ever took wasn't the longest one or the most complex one. It was the first one after you were born." He paused. He said everything changed when he had something he couldn't afford to lose. He said it made him better, and it made him more afraid, and he never could decide which one of those mattered more. He opened the door. "Get some rest, Carter." He left. Evelyn sat alone in the debrief room for a while with the recorder switched off and the afternoon light changing in the windows, and she thought about her father standing at a phone booth in 1998, and she thought about what Hale had just said, and she put those two things together and understood something about Gabriel Carter that she hadn't understood before. He'd been afraid, and he'd gone anyway. Every time. For 30 years. That wasn't the absence of fear. That was something else entirely. Matien. She called her mother at 2100. Margaret Carter answered on the second ring, which meant she'd been awake, which meant she'd been waiting, which was very. Margaret. She never admitted she was waiting, but she was always waiting when it mattered. "Hi, baby." Evelyn's throat tightened in a way it hadn't tightened once in the preceding 48 hours. She breathed through it. "Hi, Mom." "Are you okay?" "Yes." "Are you actually okay, or are you using your okay voice?" Despite everything, Evelyn almost smiled. "I'm actually okay. I'm tired." "Where are you?" "I can't say." "Of course you can't." A pause. The sound of Margaret settling into something, a chair or a couch. "Are you coming home?" "Soon. Few more days for processing and documentation." "Okay." Another pause. "Evelyn?" "Yeah. Whatever you did, wherever you were, I hope it was worth it. I hope you're—" Her mother stopped, started again. "I hope you're not carrying something you can't put down." Evelyn looked at her taped hand. "I'm working on it. Your father used to say that. Exactly that. Working on it." Margaret's voice carried something complicated in it. Grief and love, and the specific exhaustion of a woman who had spent 30 years sharing a person with something larger than herself. "He was always working on it." "I know. He would be so proud, Evelyn. You know that, right? Whatever you did, Mom. He would be so proud." He... Evelyn pressed her fingers against her eyes. Breathed. Let it move through her without fighting it the way her father had taught her, to let the environmental variables move through her calculations, not as problems to be solved, but as information to be integrated. She said, "I know he would. I know." They talked for another 40 minutes about nothing important. Her mother's garden, the neighbor's new dog, a book Margaret was reading, and it was the most normal 40 minutes Evelyn had experienced in 2 weeks, and she needed every second of it. The unexpected part happened the next morning. Evelyn was in the equipment room at 06:30, cleaning the rifle for the last time before it went back into transit packaging, when Cross appeared in the doorway. He was in civilian clothes, jeans, a gray shirt, which meant he was off the formal clock, which made the visit different from anything that had come before. He stood in the doorway for a moment. "I looked up your father's record," he said. "Full service file." Evelyn kept cleaning. And 22 years, 41 documented engagements, 17 of them above 2,000 meters. He paused. "And then I looked up what happened to him, the ambush in 2020. I know what happened. I know you do. I just—" Cross came into the room, stood with his hands in his pockets, not performing anything. "I wanted you to know that I read it, that I understand what you brought to this mission that had nothing to do with ballistics." Evelyn set the cleaning rod down, looked at him. "Most people," Cross said, "carry personal stakes into a mission, and it makes them worse. They rush, they compensate, they need the outcome too badly to be objective." He paused. "You didn't do that. I watched you for 2 days, and you were more disciplined than anyone I've worked with who had nothing personal in the game. I want to understand how." Evelyn thought about it for a moment. She wasn't sure anyone had ever asked her that directly. "Because he taught me that the mission doesn't belong to you," she said finally. "Your feelings about it, your history with it, those are yours. But the mission belongs to everyone in it, and everyone it's meant to protect. The moment you make it about yourself, you've already compromised it." She picked up the cleaning rod again. "He said that when I was 14, I didn't fully understand it until I was 24. Cross was quiet. He also said, Evelyn added that the best way to honor someone you've lost is to do the work they did better than they could teach you to. Not for them. Because of them. She looked up. There's a difference. Cross held her eyes. Then he said, I'm going to write a full commendation. My assessment of the mission, your performance, the conditions. It will be classified, but it will be on record. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. That's why it means something. He straightened. For what it's worth, and I know it's not worth much from a man who laughed at your name on a roster, I think Gabriel Carter's daughter is one of the finest operators I've ever seen work. Evelyn looked at her hands for a moment. She said, "It's worth more than you think." Cross nodded once. He turned to go. "Commander?" Evelyn said. He stopped. The south extraction route, the lower line at the third switchback. That was Kepler's contribution. Make sure that's in the commendation, too. Cross almost smiled. Already is. He left. Evelyn sat alone with the rifle across her knees and the morning quiet of the equipment room around her, and she felt the shape of the last 72 hours settling into something she could carry not lightly, that wasn't the right word, but sustainably. The way you carry something that has changed you, but hasn't broken you. The way she understood now, her father had carried it for 30 years. She finished the cleaning, packed the rifle with the same care she'd unpacked it 3 days ago, set the latches. Then she sat for a moment with her hands in her lap and her breathing even and the morning light coming through the one high window in the equipment room, and she let herself simply be in it, the fact of what she'd done, the fact of who she was because of who he'd been, the fact that the work was done, and she was still here to think about it. Her father had called a man from a payphone in 1998, and that man had been on the other end of the line, and that had been enough. Evelyn reached for her phone, scrolled to her mother's name, looked at it. Then she put the phone in her pocket, picked up the rifle case, and walked out of the equipment room into the Arizona morning. She would go home soon. She would sit at her mother's kitchen table and drink coffee she didn't have to ration and sleep in a bed that didn't require a rifle beside it. She would walk her father's property, the land he'd loved, for the same reasons she did. Its quiet, its width, the way the sky sat over it without any agenda. And she would figure out in the days and weeks ahead what she did with what she was now, because she was something different than she'd been when she'd arrived at that gate 3 days ago in mechanic coveralls with a duct-taped rifle case. Not harder, that wasn't the right word. More complete. Like a calculation that had finally resolved into a clean answer after years of open variables. She knew the answer now. She just had to learn to live inside it. She drove home alone. That was deliberate. Hale had offered transport. Cross had offered to arrange a flight. Walsh had offered to ride along as far as Phoenix, and Evelyn had declined all three with the same quiet steadiness she'd brought to everything else. She needed the drive. She needed the hours of open road and the engine sound and the particular freedom of being in motion without anyone needing anything from her. She stopped once for gas and coffee standing at the pump in the same mechanic coveralls she'd arrived in, watching the numbers climb on the display, and the man at the next pump looked at her, the way people look at someone who clearly just came from somewhere difficult. The particular kind of tired that isn't fixed by sleep. The stillness that reads as either peace or something unresolved. He didn't say anything. She didn't either. They were both just people at a gas station in the Arizona morning, and that simplicity was almost overwhelmingly welcome. She drove. The land opened up the way it always did, west of the city. Wider, flatter, the sky asserting itself with a scale that made everything human feel appropriately small. Evelyn had grown up understanding that the sky was not background. Her father had taught her that too, in the way he'd taught her everything not as a lesson, but as an orientation. Stand in something big enough, and you stop mistaking yourself for the most important thing in it. She thought about Cross in the equipment room. She thought about Hale at the payphone story. She thought about Watts saying she's correct for the 3rd time in an afternoon, and not even noticing he'd started doing it automatically. She thought about Kepler sitting in the dark, while she ran the assembly in the dark, not speaking, just present. That one she kept coming back to. There was something in it she hadn't finished understanding yet. Her mother's house came into view at 1:47 in the afternoon, and before Evelyn had fully stopped the truck, Margaret Carter was on the porch. She didn't ask questions. That was the first thing, and it mattered enormously. Margaret Carter did not ask questions about the things she understood she wasn't meant to know. What she did instead was put food on the table and coffee in a cup, and sit across from her daughter in the kitchen, that still had the same curtains it had when Gabriel was alive, and she let Evelyn be wherever she was without requiring an explanation of it. They sat for nearly an hour like that, talking about small things. The neighbor's dog, which had turned out to be a border collie mix with strong opinions about the fence line. A book Margaret was reading about a woman who restored old maps. The way the peach tree in the yard had finally recovered from the late frost 2 springs ago. Evelyn let it wash over her. The ordinary rhythm of it. The sound of her mother's voice moving through subject to subject, the way water moves through familiar ground unhurried, finding its own level. Then Margaret said, without changing her tone at all, "You did what you went to do." It wasn't a question. Evelyn looked at her coffee cup. "Yes." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then, "And your father?" "It's done," Evelyn said. "Whatever was owed, it's done." Margaret nodded slowly. Something moved through her face, grief and relief, and the complex math of a woman who had spent 4 years holding 2 things simultaneously, the loss of her husband, and the knowledge that the person responsible remained alive somewhere in the world. Evelyn watched her mother absorb it and settle into it, and the settling was not happiness exactly, but it was something that had been suspended for a long time coming to rest. "Good," Margaret said finally. "Just that. Good." They sat with it together, mother and daughter in the kitchen with the old curtains, and outside the peach tree moved in the afternoon wind, and it was enough. The harder conversation came that evening. Evelyn had been walking the property her father's habit, the evening perimeter he'd called it, not for security, but for the ritual of knowing the edges of the place you lived, when Margaret came out and fell into step beside her without asking. They walked for a while. Then Margaret said, "Hale called me this morning." Evelyn looked at her. "He what?" "Before you arrived. He wanted me to know you were safe before you got here, so I wouldn't be reading it on your face when you drove up." Margaret kept walking, eyes ahead. "He's a good man." "He is," Evelyn said, still processing. "What did he say?" "That you'd done something extraordinary, that your father would recognize it." Margaret paused. "He also said you were going to need time, and that I shouldn't try to rush it or interpret it, just let it be what it is." Evelyn said, "He's right." "I know he's right. I spent 22 years not rushing your father." Her mother's voice was dry but not hard. "I've had practice." They walked to the east edge of the property, where the fence had a view of the open land beyond. Evelyn stood at it and looked out the way. Her father had stood at it thousands of times, and she felt him there, not as absence, not as grief, but as presence. The way the people we've loved most become part of the place where they lived. "Mom," she said. "Yeah. I'm going to stop taking contracts." Margaret went very still. Evelyn kept her eyes on the open land. "Not all of it. The training work, the consultation, I'll continue that. But the operational side, the work I was doing out there, I'm done with it." "Since when?" "Since the helicopter," Evelyn said. "I sat there on the flight back, and I ran through the operational debrief in my head, the way I always do, cataloging everything, and at the end of it, I realized I wasn't thinking about the next mission. I was thinking about coming home." She paused. "That's new. That's never happened before." Margaret turned to look at her daughter in the fading light. She studied her for a moment with the specific attention of a mother who has been reading this face since it was 3 days old. "You're sure?" she asked. "I'm sure." Margaret looked back at the open land. Something moved in her face that was too large and too private to name, and she let it move through her without trying to contain it. Then she put her hand on Evelyn's arm, just rested it there light and warm, and said nothing at all, which was the right answer. The call from Watts came 4 days later. She was in the workshop behind the house running diagnostics on a rifle she'd been contracted to evaluate for a civilian manufacturer. Clean work, technical work, the kind that lived entirely in the data and required nothing from the part of her she was currently trying to rest. Her phone was on the workbench and she almost didn't pick it up. She picked it up. "Carter, it's Watts." A pause. "I hope I'm not. Is this an okay time?" "Yes, what's happening?" "Nothing operational," he said quickly. "Nothing like that. The verification documentation came through this morning. Official. All 4 systems confirm the distance. It's in the record." Another pause. "I thought you should hear it from someone who was there." Evelyn set down the tool she was holding. "Thank you, Watts. The report also includes the weather station data," he said, and she could hear in his voice that he was smiling slightly. "The one you deployed before you arrived. I made sure it was cited correctly in the technical appendix." "You didn't have to do that." "I know." A brief silence. "Carter, can I ask you something?" "Not official. Just, I've been thinking about it since the flight back." "Go ahead." "In the moment," he said. "When you fired, what were you thinking?" Evelyn was quiet for a moment. She looked at the rifle on the workbench in front of her. "Nothing," she said. "I wasn't thinking anything. Nothing. My father called it the quiet. The place you get to when everything that needed to happen has already happened, and the only thing left is to stop being in the way." She paused. "I was in the quiet." Watts was silent for a few seconds. "I've been working ballistics for 11 years, he said. "I've never heard anyone describe it that way." "Most people haven't found it yet," she said. "That's not a criticism. It takes time." "How long did it take you?" 16 years of practice and 4 years of grief," she said. "I wouldn't recommend that particular path." Watts made a sound that was half laugh and half something more serious. "Fair enough." Another pause. "For what it's worth, working with you was the best thing I've done in this job. I mean that." "The South Route modification was the best thing you did," Evelyn said. "When you told me the weather station data right before I was about to go past verbal processing, that was exactly the right call. That's not a small thing, Watts." He was quiet for a moment. "I'll remember that," he said. "Thanks, Carter. Take care of yourself." She set the phone down and sat for a moment in the workshop with the afternoon light and the half-disassembled rifle and the feeling of something slowly, piece by piece, returning to a shape she recognized as her own. The twist came 3 weeks later, and she almost missed it. She was at her father's desk. She'd started using, it had moved into the study, the way she'd moved into his work, carefully, and with awareness of what she was occupying, when an encrypted message came through a channel she'd kept active for professional correspondence. The sender ID resolved to a name she knew, but hadn't expected: Colonel Diane Marsh, USMC, Special Programs Division. The message was brief. "Carter, the record is confirmed. What comes next is your choice. But we have a training program. Level 3 Precision Operators, 12 candidates that has been without a primary instructor for 4 months. The position is yours if you want it. No operational requirement, no contracts. You teach, that's all. Marsh." Evelyn read it twice. Set the phone face down on the desk, stood, walked to the window, stood there for a while. Then she picked up the phone and read it a third time. She hadn't gone looking for this. She'd decided on the helicopter that she was done with the operational side, and she'd meant it, and she still meant it. But teaching instruction transmission, the passing forward of something that wasn't the same thing. That was what you did with what you'd learned when you were finished needing to prove it. Her father had been the best teacher she'd ever had, and he'd never once called himself a teacher. He'd just shown her things, corrected her, sat in the dark while she worked, answered her questions without condescension, trusted her with information that was real and therefore heavy. She thought about Watts 11 years in, who hadn't found the quiet yet. She thought about Walsh, who had tracked wind data with the same attention she'd brought to communication protocols, who had potential. She wasn't sure anyone had named for her directly. She thought about 12 candidates in a program that had been without direction for 4 months, learning from materials and drills, and each other without someone to show them what it looked like when everything came together. She sat back down at her father's desk. She wrote back, "Marsh, I have conditions. No classified operational integration for the candidates during the program. They learn the work before they learn what the work costs. Curriculum is mine to build. I bring one consultant of my choice for the environmental and ballistics component, and the program runs for a full year, not a compressed cycle. If those hold, yes. Carter." She sent it before she could rethink it. The response came in 40 minutes. All 4 conditions accepted. "Welcome aboard. Marsh." Evelyn set the phone down and looked at the desk. Her father's handwriting was still visible in the grain of it, not literally, but she saw it anyway, the way you see the people you've lost in the objects they inhabited. He'd sat at this desk and planned missions and written letters and read the same book she was now reading. And he'd understood something about this work that had taken her this long to understand herself. The rifle was just metal. It was the operator who gave it meaning, and the instructor who gave the operator understanding, and the understanding that made the difference between a weapon and a tool and a responsibility. She called Watts. He answered on the third ring. Carter. How's your calendar for the next year? A pause. Why? I have a training program. 12 level 3 candidates. I need the best ballistics and environmental analysis mind I've worked with, and I need someone who can explain the technical side without making it feel like a lecture. You just described two different people, Watts said. I described you, she said. You just haven't realized it yet. Another pause longer. She could hear him processing it the way she'd watched him process trajectory data, methodically, not rushing checking every variable. When does it start? He asked. 6 weeks. Location? To be confirmed, probably Southwest. Full year commitment? Full year. He was quiet for a moment more. Then, send me the program parameters when you have them. Does that mean yes? It means send me the parameters, Carter. She almost smiled. I'll have them to you by Friday. She hung up and sat in the quiet of her father's study and let herself feel fully and without defense the particular satisfaction of a person who has found the shape of what comes next and recognizes it as something worth building. 6 weeks later, she stood in front of 12 candidates for the first time. They were seated in a loose half-circle, the way she'd asked, rather than the formal rows the facility had arranged. Young, most of them. Serious faces with the particular alertness of people who'd been selected for something and weren't sure yet what it would require. A few of them had clearly looked her up. She could tell by the way certain ones held themselves differently than the others, slightly less at ease recalibrating something. She recognized that recalibration. She'd caused it before. She set her rifle case on the table at the front of the room and did not open it. My name is Evelyn Carter, she said. My father was Gabriel Carter, who some of you may know by reputation and some of you may not. What you need to know about him for the purposes of this program is that he was the best teacher I've ever had, and that I'm going to try to be worthy of that for the next 12 months. She looked around the room. 12 faces. 12 different configurations of talent and experience and potential. I'm not going to tell you about the record today, she said. If you've looked it up, fine. If you haven't, that's also fine. The distance is not the point of this program. The distance is the result of the point of this program, which is this. She paused. You don't fire the rifle. The rifle fires. Your job, the entire job, everything we will spend a year working on is learning how to get completely out of the way. A hand went up in the second row. A young woman, dark hair pulled back with the kind of focused expression that meant she was not performing attentiveness, but actually paying attention. What does that mean exactly? She asked. Getting out of the way. Evelyn looked at her. She'd remember this moment later, the question, the face, the quality of attention in the room. It means that every variable you control in advance, Evelyn said. The environmental data, the ballistics calculation, the physical preparation, the equipment, all of it before you get behind the glass. And then when you're in position and the moment comes, there is nothing left to decide. Everything that needed to happen has already happened. The only thing left is to stop being in the way of what you've prepared. The young woman nodded slowly. And if you haven't prepared enough, then you're not ready, Evelyn said simply, and you don't take the shot. The room was quiet. That's the first principle, Evelyn said. The second one we'll cover tomorrow. Today, I want to hear from each of you not about your record or your background. I want to know what you think you don't know yet. What you're here to learn. She looked around the room. Because the people who already know what they need to learn are the people I can actually teach. The first candidate to speak was the young woman in the second row. Her name was Torres, no relation, and she said, I don't know yet what it feels like to be completely certain. I know how to calculate certainty. I don't know how to feel it." Evelyn looked at her for a moment. "That," she said, "is exactly the right answer." And the teaching began. 3 months into the program, Evelyn received a package from Cross. No note inside, just a framed copy of the mission verification document, distances and conditions, and confirmation signatures. The kind of thing that belonged in a record somewhere and that she'd never thought to keep. She put it in her father's study. Not on the wall in the closet on a shelf alongside the things he'd kept that meant something privately and didn't need an audience. Then she went back to work. That was the whole of it. That was the thing her father had tried to tell her in 100 small ways across a lifetime. And that she had finally fully understood. The shot was not the story. The shot was a single resolved variable in a calculation that had taken decades to build. The story was the preparation and the teaching and the long discipline of becoming the kind of person who could get completely out of the way when it mattered. Evelyn Carter had taken a shot at 3,247 meters that stunned everyone who witnessed it, set a record that would stand for years, and honored the man who had spent his life showing her what precision actually required. She had also walked out of the equipment room in the Arizona morning and chosen without drama what she would build next. The rifle was just metal. Everything it meant, the discipline, the judgment, the long patience of mastery, and the responsibility that came with it, that was Evelyn. It always had been. Always.